So good evening, friends. My name is Matthew. My pronouns are he and him. Last time I preached here, I was still a member of this church, and a couple of weeks ago, I announced that I was going to be stepping back here. And as I say, that sermon I checked, and I clocked up the longest ordinary sermon on the YouTube page since 2018. Now, I have some slides to help make sure that I treat you guys correctly tonight, just so that I actually stick to time and sort of make it somewhat reasonable if I don't. I'm going to explain quickly the orange and the blue. If you don't know, if this is not a tradition you're a part of, this is how we make consensus decisions in the Uniting Church. Those of you who were here at the AGM earlier today might have done this. So, orange is when you are warm to a proposal and basically you're saying, yes, I like this idea. Blue is when you are feeling a bit cool towards that proposal and you say, I don't like this and I don't want it. And partly I want to do this because I haven't been particularly uniting church very recently. I've been a lot more Baptist. And so I just wanted to get a bit of a dose of what you guys are taking in here. So let's have some uniting insights with love to the world. So today I have a 3-point sermon, very uniting church of me, and I'm going to invite you all to, as the Spirit leads, use your blue and orange cards while I speak. So we'll start with a few test propositions. They're on the screen now so that you can sort of think ahead as to what your feeling is and feel, is it warm or is it a bit more cold? So first, Jesus, how do we feel? Good. Oranges all around. Fantastic. We have consensus. Jesus is. Second, Judas. Oh. Do we have a yellow? Is that yellow or is that an orange? You got questions for Judas. Okay, orange. Judas, I'm seeing a few more blues. Great. Elijah, what do we think? Is he cool? Wow, we have a consensus. Elijah is cool. Elisha, what do we think? Oh, a couple of blues. Oh, so we're not sold on this Elisha fella. What about Elisha? Okay, we like that. Elisha, for those of you who don't, I don't know, like that's what a lot of people pronounce his name as, but we tried saying Elisha because it's easier to understand that it's a different guy. What about Chariots of Fire from 1981? Okay, we don't have consensus. We've got work to do. What about sin? I don't know. I'm a Baptist. Move on. All right. If we don't like sin, do we like good works as a way of life for those followers of Christ? Yes. Are you holding your blue up for that? No. All right, what about prophets? How do we feel about prophets? Great. What about prophets? Okay. What do we think of bears? What about the North Sydney Western Himalayan red bears? Have any of you guys heard that the bears are back? That's what I wanted to call this sermon, but Rad's refused point blank. The Papua New Guinea Kumuls. They're the National Rugby League team for Papua New Guinea. Yeah, great. What about the Papua New Guinea Chiefs? They are the incoming NRL team for Papua New Guinea. Yeah. What do we think of Deadpool? Is that not there? It's on my list. So what do you guys think of Deadpool? The guy. A couple of people who are a bit cool on Deadpool. All right, what about Uniting Church Memes, the Instagram page? All right, what do we think of Leichhardt Uniting Church? Yeah. Well done. And what do we think of 3-point sermons starting off with unrelated points? All right, move on. So today I have a 3-point sermon. Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. And I'm going to get... Oh, they're all one. I have a 1-point sermon. And I want to see your cards for each of these points, okay? So first, prophecy is important. What do we think? Is prophecy important? Great. Succession planning is really hard, point 1. Great, yes, okay, so we're warm to that idea. And the Spirit moves, point 1. Yes. Okay. Let's get into it. So, prophecy is incredibly important, at least I think so, and most of you do too, if your cards are anything to go by. So what the heck is it? All right? Because I think maybe not so much in this church where we tend to talk about it a bit, but the idea of prophecy I think often brings to mind things like goat's entrails and crystal balls and trying to sort of guess what's going to happen in the future. And that's not really key to what biblical prophecy is. The way I'm describing it tonight, and I've said this in different ways before, but the way that it feels right today is that prophecy is knowing what story you're in, being able to tell other people what story they're in. So, some stories are hero stories with a bad guy and a good guy, and they'll hash it out. Some stories are tragedies. Some stories are comedies. What's the other one that Shakespeare does? Doesn't. Yeah? Some stories are histories, and that's, I don't know. The role of a prophet is to go back into history, to look into the stories that are being told and have been told before, and then to remind the people who are there today what story they're in. So, in a sense, I think the title of this on YouTube will end up being that prophets are the Deadpool of the Bible. Because they know that they're in a story. Yeah, they know that they're in a story. They know what that story is. And that means they can look at the camera and make a point about it. So how do we feel about that as an idea? You've got cards. Don't give me a thumbs up. I don't care about that. Yeah. So, I find when reading the books of Kings and Chronicles and things like Judges, that sort of run of history stories that sort of come through and tell the story of where they've been and where they're going and what's going on, feels a bit like reading a prequel to like a post-apocalyptic movie or something like that. You know the characters are going to die. You know that the gambit they're going on won't work, so to speak. Particularly because in this passage it builds up towards the exile to Babylon and the destruction of the temple. In what is quite a traumatic event in the history of Israel, and was also when most of the Old Testament was put to paper. Now, this story, I think, is really important to reckon with because it's still going on. I was at the march earlier today, and most of us have been to various marches calling for peace and for an end to the violence. And that story is playing out from these stories from the past. And so, in a sense, when you read the work of Elijah and Elisha, it feels like reading a tragedy, that they're trying to warn the kings of Israel, guys, you're in a tragedy. This doesn't end well the way you're going. You've got to take control of that. You've got to fix it. And there's these moments where it feels like it starts working, but it slowly falls apart. So in this way, the role of the prophet is not to necessarily look into the future, but to actually look into the past and to remember the stories and the places we've been, because they come back in echoes. And I think now, in Gaza, there is an echo of some of the stories of the past. And even here, this handover of authority from Elijah to Elisha is a really critical one, because it hands over I guess, the role of prophet, the role of Deadpool. I hate that I chose that. I'm sorry that I did that. That's almost the worst thing I've done in this sermon. I've already done so many things. But to hand over the role of that narrative reminder from Elijah to Elisha is really critical. Because Elijah imitates and mimics Moses in a lot of ways. And I think some of those are partly narrative themselves, but some of them are quite substantial. Moses most significantly met with God at Mount Sinai at a place called Horeb. And when Moses met God, God told Moses what God's name was forever. We now use the word Yahweh to try to capture some of that. And God was presented in a burning bush that was not quenched. That fire was not put out or destructive. Elijah met God in exactly the same place, in the sound of sheer silence. Moses, who wrought destruction on the slave drivers who forsook God, and Elijah, who personally slaughtered the priests of Baal and ended their racketeering and blasphemy. Now, murder is still wrong, but there is an imitation there. Moses, a murderer; Elijah, a murderer. Moses, who parted the sea of reeds to free his people, and Elijah, who here parts the river Jordan. And then in this handover, Moses, who gives his staff to Joshua, and Elijah, who rolls up his mantle and gives it to Elisha. And then Joshua, right, to continue on this mimicry, Joshua mimics Elisha. Joshua, who went to Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. And Elisha, whose first act as a prophet immediately after this, and you can check your Bibles for this, he goes to Jericho and he makes their water drinkable. The imitation, the echoes that play out here are really important, and when we miss them, we misunderstand what it is to be a prophet. See, Joshua himself conquered the promised land in a clash that still leaves an echo that is ringing on today. And when we misunderstand what that meant, we allow it to continue. And Elisha, who, as I say, if you read the end of this passage, he sets a couple of bears on a group of children. If we read that and don't understand what's going on with that, then we risk thinking that's okay. Now, the other part of prophecy then, if part of it is remembering the past and telling the story, the other part is actually imagining what a different story might be. And actually making that tangible, making that something you can imagine and see so that you can work towards it. So this is now our second point. Succession planning is really hard because when you're working towards an imagined future that has been presented to you as though it is an echo of the past, it is really hard to let that go and hand it on to someone else who has to run that race for you. Which is why I think it's really important that we read these stories of Moses handing on, Moses being the one who knew that he would never make it to his destination, and Elijah, who knew he was done. Now, in this church, I say succession planning is hard. We have a perpetually young congregation, and people like me come here in our early 20s and then we leave. And that's a massive, massive challenge. Because succession planning is really hard. And I think this is why, particularly in this church, what I was taught here was how to organize. To organize people so that they understood who they are and what their job was. Because in this church and in all other churches, we are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And that means we have our place and we have our thing to do. It's really important what I've got written here is that what we need to be doing if we want a succession plan is we need to be following what's called the iron rule. The iron rule of organising, that you should never do for someone what they can do for themselves, what they can do themselves. The whole point of building these things we call churches is so that we can equip new leaders to go out and make the story of God known. And so we need to make sure that we're not doing that bit that someone else can do. See, our prophets in this community should be prophesying, and if you don't feel called to prophecy, good. Preachers in this community should preach, and if you don't feel called to preach, good. The caring ones in our community should care, and if you don't feel called to care, then good. The people who can cook in this community should cook, and if you don't feel called to cook, good. But if you feel that you have some sense of call or some sense of capacity to do something that you're not, do it. Grab it. Because that's how we succession plan. That's what Elijah does with Elisha. Elijah continually says, I'm going to go do this thing by myself. And Elisha says, well, I can too. And grabs hold. And I love reading through the rest of, particularly through 1 Kings, where Elijah didn't really do much active leadership development with Elisha. Didn't really run many courses or programs or putting him through any training or anything like that. It was quite literally, he threw his mantle and Elisha caught it and then didn't leave his side. And so for the leaders in this community, if there are things you're doing you know someone else can do, let them go. And for those of you who don't think of yourself as a leader yet, grab the mantle. That's something that this passage really, really clearly shows us is important. And yet the Spirit moves. This is all important because whether we want it or not, change comes. Seasons come and go. Things die, things are born. There is a time for all of them. Most importantly, prophecies change when the stories change. And what I think really matters when we read these Old Testament passages and we go looking for wisdom in them is that we remember that we are followers of Jesus, the living one, the one who conquered death. And that is not static. We follow the Spirit. We follow Yahweh, whose name means the one who is what it is, the one who is what it will be. Quite simply saying, the God we follow is eternal, and the world we're in is changing. And so the way we follow should change. Because after all, the one sentence summary, the best one I've ever managed to get for the gospel, is that in God's kingdom, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And then, if you've done a good enough job of that, flip them back. And flip them back. The situations change and we should too. And that's why it's important that we follow the Spirit. How many of you know what the word Spirit means? And how are we doing, cards? Like, are we feeling okay about what I'm saying? And does anyone want me to shut up? Oh. The word Spirit means breath. We attach a lot of magic to it, and we think it means something a lot bigger than that, but it is quite simply. And the Holy Spirit is in many ways what we should be listening to every time we open our Bible. Because the important thing about breathing and the important thing about following that holy breath is that it moves and it changes, breathes in and it breathes out. Now I'm going to come to the end of this sermon by going over some points. Namely that the Bible itself is a big collection of books. And ultimately it is the role of prophecy, the role of interpretation and good hermeneutics to help us understand what genre those stories are, let alone what they mean. Hermeneutics meaning effectively interpretation. And if you ever find something heinous in the Bible, as we do at the end of this passage, where a bunch of children are killed by some bears at the direction of a man of God, consider who is saying it, consider why they're saying it, consider what purpose they're saying it for. Usually, when it's a command from God for how we're supposed to live our life, they're not particularly heinous. They're not particularly terrible. And sometimes it really takes a lot of prayer and a lot of listening to the Spirit to understand what they mean. Because honestly, I cannot faithfully read this passage without mentioning the bears. And I cannot faithfully mention the bears and in any way justify that as being okay. Yes, Elisha is given a heavy mantle. He's told it will be hard, and then he is sent to figure it out. And yes, I am confused by the idea of a Bible that doesn't actually point out the big mistakes that we make, particularly the fallible characters, like all of the people. And I do think it's really important that we actually question our forebears, instead of just blindly choosing to repeat their worst moments. Because that's partly what prophecy does, is it helps us remember the bad bits and the bad choices. And what is important is we need to remember those bad choices and name them what they are. Because today, as they work through a ceasefire agreement that is very complicated and not at all perfect, if we are approaching that story from a perspective that says we should reenact what seemed like a previous triumph, then we need to question that. Because it is through prophecy that we can still do today, that we can remind them what story they're in, and remind them which parts were the good parts and which parts were the horrible parts that we have to remember so we never do them again. Because the thing about us as followers of Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, is that through Jesus' life and death and resurrection, the story changed and things became new. The Spirit breathed, the page turned, the stone was rolled away, and the Spirit breathed again.